Welcome to the AirCon Vault, recordings of the live streams from AirWiggle's audio conference. These are made free thanks to our sponsors: A Sound Effect, Game Audio Learning, Kilohertz, Audio Kinetic, Soundcuts, Tsugi, Boom Library, Sound Warriors, and AirWiggles, the online home for audio people.
This talk is all about problem solving. Houston, we have a problem. Fighting, defending, and preventing problems in game audio. But before we start, if you haven't played Helldivers 2, I'm really sorry. This talk is packed full of references, but don't worry, you won't miss anything if you haven't played it, because yeah, it's just, I'll have everything clear. And I just want to state that I'm not affiliated with Helldivers 2 or any of the studios that have worked on it. I am simply in love with the game, and I'm using it to make this talk a little bit more fun, because problems can be a dry topic. So yeah, we want to add some spice to that. And there will be time for questions at the end. So yeah, don't worry at all. If you have any, you can ask them and I'll get to them at the end. So first off, who am I? My name is Greg Lester. Many of you might know me, some of you might not. I make sounds for video games for a living, and I enjoy to talk, write, make videos, make websites, and do other things about game audio. And you might have seen some of these icons, including the newest edition, the Pocket Mentor for Game Audio, woo! Which Johnny Sands and I spent the last 2 years writing. And it is coming out in October, and it is a book, of course. And actually, this talk is based on one of the chapters. So if you enjoy the talk, then maybe give the book a look. And yeah, it'll be out in October. So very excited for that. I also like to do bouldering and Muay Thai. I have a huge Lego collection, but in the wrong country, because I don't have enough space here in the UK. And I'm usually the warmest dressed person in any group. So yeah, I am the wearer of jackets. I have also played 4,008 hours in League of Legends, and I clearly have a number of problems. However, problems, in my opinion, are like Terminids, those pesky bugs in Helldivers. And that means that they're easy to kill when they're tiny and in small groups, but they become overwhelming when they're large and in big hordes. They can also be categorized into different groups, which have their strengths and weaknesses. They can be killed easier with special weapons and preparation, so tools and tactics. They can be eradicated so they don't come back. And we can practice and get better at fighting them and level up and acquire new tools and tactics to fight them. And that is exactly what this talk is about. So we'll be looking at the different categories of problems. We'll be looking at how we can prepare and what kind of tools and strategies and tactics we can use to fight them, how we can eradicate them and prevent them, how we can practice in a safe environment and get better at fighting them, and how we can level up and acquire new tools and tactics in order to fight them better. And yes, Lewis, I do love an analogy. So first off, mission briefing time. We've got 3 types of problems, starting with technical problems, also known as bugs. Auditory problems and pipeline problems. Pipeline problems are definitely the scariest, and we'll get to that soon, why that is. Technical problems happen usually at an implementation level, so middleware, game engine, or in the code. They cause the audio playback to break generally. And that means, for example, a sound is not being triggered, resulting in silence, or a sound is being triggered too often, causing multiple instances of the sound to overlap, or a variable in the game data is needed to modify the audio, and that is broken or incorrect. Or you submitted an empty sound file and that results in a missing sound. Has definitely happened to me once or twice. Oopsie. Auditory problems generally means it doesn't sound right. They are multi-level problems, kind of like across design, implementation, or mixing. So they can happen kind of like at many different levels or multiple different levels. And generally the problem is that they fail to convey information, feedback, or emotion to the player effectively. It's also unclear to the player when they're running out of ammunition. So this could be an example, for example. Or the car doesn't feel fast enough when driving at high speeds. Or the level in this horror game doesn't feel scary. Or there's too much going on at once when there are lots of enemies on screen. So yeah, those are different problems that you might encounter with auditory problems. Then pipeline problems, which are at a management level generally, and they cover the systems, logistics, and the interpersonal relationships, among other things. Pipeline problems, just in general, make it hard to do our jobs well. They're a headache, and some examples are animation timings keep changing, and the audio team isn't being made aware of the changes and only finding them in retrospect when they open the game engine and see it's out of sync again. A regularly scheduled meeting with no clear purpose or objectives, wasting development time instead of saving it. I'm sure you've had those before, where everyone comes into a meeting and then it's just kind of like wishy-washy, nothing gets done, and everyone's just wasted a bunch of time. Or the delivery speed of different assets varies drastically between team members doing the same thing. Or, for example, a key member of the team is leaving or taking extended time off, and that then results in a huge kind of knowledge gap and all kinds of issues. So how do we deal with these problems? Well, we attack them. Because attacking means that we will have the initiative, so we can decide how to attack and when to attack. And of course, some problems will come at you no matter what. These are usually bugs, but in general, especially with auditory and pipeline problems, we can attack them early and not wait till they build up. We will also reduce their numbers, making them more manageable. So by being proactive, we obviously solve and get rid of issues, making an overall cleaner, well, work environment with less problems. And we will destroy their spawn points by continuously attacking. So we'll actually be able to prevent them in the future instead of just fighting the symptoms. By ignoring them, they will eventually attack us because they'll just become overwhelming, and then we will have to deal with them and we won't get to choose when. And they will multiply, and eventually they will simply overwhelm us because when there's too many problems stacked up, it's just really hard to deal with them. So what is our plan of attack? Well, there's a process for this, and that is reproduce, debug, fix, and test the problem. So in a nutshell, what that means is that we want to gather information about the problem, then we want to create a diagnosis, then we want to apply the treatment, and then we want to see if it works. So first off, reproducing. We want to reliably recreate the problem. That is our number one goal here. And that means getting it to happen 100% of the time. And this is often handled by a QA tester. But before we get to that, basically, problems, you would think, oh yeah, happens 100% of the time, no problem. So we deal with it. But there are a lot of scenarios where, for example, problems, especially like technical bugs, only happen some of the time. And then that is a big headache, because if something only happens occasionally, then we have to figure out, okay, how do we make it happen 100%? And then we can actually get to the root of things. So yeah, that's important. And yeah, QA testers, also known as quality assurance testers, they are awesome and they deal with a lot of these things. So they play test the game and they're really skilled at finding, reproducing, and documenting different issues. They deal less with pipeline problems and stuff like that, but very much with gameplay and sometimes even auditory problems. So for reproducing, we need to find out a couple of things. So we need to figure out what is happening, when does it happen, and where does it happen, as well as how does it happen. So this is based on the problem. So let's look at an example. The robot problem. You notice the robot is still playing voice lines after it exploded, but this happens only occasionally. So now we have a problem that doesn't happen every single time. It just happens sometimes. So we need to proceed by asking what is happening, when does it happen, where does it happen, and how. So for example, the what could be, Okay, well, we know the voice lines is playing. Can we nail down what kind of voice line is playing? Is it multiple? Is it just one? When does this happen? Does it happen after doing something specific? It says it happens after exploding. Does it also happen if the robot, I don't know, dies in a different way? Where does it happen exactly? Does it happen in all the levels? Does it only happen in a certain area? What are the parameters and how? So this is kind of like all of the above. In what circumstance? So what do I have to do in order to recreate it? And the details for this really matter, because sometimes it makes a whole lot of difference if this only happens in a very certain area of the map or in a very certain circumstance. So make sure to write all the details down. And remember that our goal is to recreate the problem. It's not immediately fix it. So just focus on getting all the steps in place to actually recreate it. So yeah, robot problem part 2. So we've managed to reproduce the problem. We found out that it only happens when we shoot at it while it's exploding. So if we let it explode without, it's fine. And so this also happens with all the weapons and in all of the levels. So we know, okay, this is probably something to do with just the explosion and those assets. So now that we have the problem in our sights, we can actually go and analyze it. And that is debugging. And it means really asking, why is this happening? And this sentence, there's no way that's causing the problem, has wasted a lot of my time because problems are often hidden in plain sight, especially pesky bugs. And yeah, I have on many occasions overlooked the solution by simply dismissing it. So yeah, make sure that you follow the steps starting at the start and go through each single one. Obviously, with time, you will get an instinct for, oh, this problem might be caused by that, and then obviously you can skip some of the steps. But if it's not that, then start at the start, because otherwise you will just bounce around and miss things, and it will just take way more time. So another thing is we want to reframe the problem sometimes, especially when we're stuck. So if we get feedback, the car doesn't sound fast enough, then the question to ask, of course, is, why does it not sound fast enough? But the conclusion to that then would be, well, the engine needs to sound faster. Probably that is the conclusion. But if we reframe the question, what does moving at high speeds actually sound like? Then the conclusion might be different. And that could mean we can add more wind, we can add more pass-bys, we can add more Doppler effects, and we can improve the engine. So it's all of a sudden a multi-pronged solution. And yeah, that means sometimes we're very zoomed in, and reframing the question can help us zoom out so we don't lose sight of the periphery. And here's a visual example with a bonnet cam versus a chase cam on a car. So have you ever explained a problem to someone only to realize the answer halfway through? I definitely have. And there's a phenomenon actually, and a whole term, and it's called rubber duck debugging. And you might have heard of it, especially if you're more technical, because it comes from the programming world. And that is basically explaining the problem step by step, which helps clarify our thoughts and improves our understanding of the problem. So we want to basically explain the problem, write down some of the details, and even if we can illustrate it, that will then help us to take the information from our head, put it onto paper, and examine the problem from all angles, because now we have like all the details and facts that we can look at and remember, rather than simply kind of keeping it all in our head and having this whole detective spiel in there. And you can use any inanimate object for that. So this Helldivers themed duck is excellent, of course. However, I myself like to use this brain cell that my girlfriend gifted to me. What a better way to debug than using a brain cell? I mean, come on. Look how cute this thing is. If we don't have enough information, which sometimes we don't, then we need to look at profilers and debug logs. So what is a profiler? Essentially, oversimplified, it shows the journey of the sound. So we can find out what events started the sound, what events stopped the sound, what is happening along the journey. Is it going through reverb? Is it being filtered? Is it having modulation added to it? And what game data is actually affecting it? Have you checked the profiler? Your neighborhood technical sound designer. Whenever I have a problem and I ask my technical sound designer, I'm like, hello, please help me. Then the first question is always, what does the profiler say? Have you checked it? What's going on? Tell me. So yeah, check the profiler. You might have seen this before. This is Wise, and we have a whole bunch of different things in the profiler here. So we have up here our capture log, which basically tells us when things are happening. So when an event starts or is paused or stopped or other things. We have a voice inspector. It tells us kind of like, oh, this is being muted by that, and this is going through this modulation. So you can see here that what are all the different voices within that. And then we also have the voice monitor. So this is especially useful for monitoring RTPCs or volumes and things like that. Then we have a second tab with more information, especially about the performance. But this one is the one that is most useful to us most of the time. Then debug logs have to come into play sometimes, especially when we are looking at things that are outside of the middleware and inside of the game engine. So a debug log is often also known as the output or console log, provides us with more information, especially about the game engine stuff. And it tells us, as I said, what is happening in the game engine. And these things can also be displayed at runtime, so while the game is running. It also comes up with warning and error messages, which sometimes just straight up give us a solution to the problem, which is very, very useful. They often look something like this and are a little bit harder for the untrained eye to decipher, but generally we have to read things and use Google to decipher, or the knowledge of our colleagues. So back to the robot problem. We know that when we shoot at the robot while it's exploding in the animation, it continues to play the voice line after death. Okay, so we can then use the Wise profiler and our detective skills to figure out what voice lines are actually the perpetrators. And then we can, once we found them, see what are the settings and what events are they attached to. In this case, the VO lines in question weren't connected to the stop play event at death. Therefore, they didn't get told to stop and they just kept playing. So that is, of course, a very easy fix. And yeah, now we need to implement that fix, of course. So bugs, generally simple once you know what's wrong. With robot example, we just need to connect the VO line to the stop event. But what happens with auditory and pipeline problems? Well, they are often not so simple. And for complex multi-layer problems like those, we need to consider all the solutions we can think of. So, of course, with a VO line like that, it's like there's not tons of solutions. But if the engine doesn't sound right, or like if the car doesn't sound fast enough, there might be tons of different solutions. Might even be because of the mix. And then we need to consider what are the pros and cons of each single one of these. And also, what are the potential knock-on effects if we implement a solution for the other things? So again, taking our car example, maybe if we make the engine beefier and louder, then it will take up more space in the mix in terms of frequencies, and then it might get muddy when we are driving next to other cars. So that might be a knock-on effect. What we also can do is copy homework. So a lot of problems are encountered by a game dev team one way or another. And so we can ask ourselves, how have other games and teams solved this? So let's take the example of a first-person shooter. It's unclear that the player is running out of ammo. Common problem. Lots of FPS games have guns with ammo, and that's something that they need to convey. So there's an existing solution from other games that we can implement, or multiple rather. One of them is we can play UI sound when we get low ammo. This is probably less interesting for realistic or like gritty simulation games. More interesting for cartoony games. We can play character dialogue. This is awesome. But if you are absolutely running and gunning like a maniac and reloading every couple of seconds, especially with a sidearm, then that might not be ideal because you keep hearing your character say, out of ammo, reloading. And so, yeah. We also then could change the sound of the weapon as the ammo decreases. So the questions we need to ask, is it clear enough? Is our solution that we put in clear enough? Is it likely to go repetitive and or annoying? Like, for example, the UI or the character dialogue. What solutions are less work to implement? And how much time do we have? And then how easy would it be to apply this to all the game's weapons? So of course we need to look at it in context and scale as well. And so then we can say, all right, let's choose a solution or multiple and execute. So what solutions or combinations work best? What steps do we need to take to implement them? Do we need additional game data? Do we need engineering support? Do we need to design new sounds? Do we need to reassign jobs within the team? And all of these can, again, have knock-on effects. So it's important to speak to the team, especially the producers, because if we have a solution that will require engineering support, but we haven't spoken to the producers and the engineering team, we might find out after we've already decided internally that they don't have any capacity to help us, in which case we then have to go back to the drawing board. So we need to make sure to consider all of the solutions and speak to the right people before we 100% decide on anything. So with the first-person shooter example, after copying the homework, we decided to introduce another layer that becomes louder when the lower the ammo gets. We can make other layers quieter the lower the ammo gets, and we can also have voice lines that play after a cooldown timer, so that you won't get like tons of dialogue next to each other. But if you're firing like a heavy machine gun, it takes a long time to run from start to end, then voice line makes a lot of sense, especially if it's firing at a fast rate. So next step, we have to test and see how it sounds. So testing means reproducing the problem, which in this case is literally pressing the trigger, shooting the gun till it runs out of ammo. Then, is it fixed? Have any new problems appeared? Well, the new problems appearing, that actually is an issue, because there have been loads of times where, especially with technical problems and bugs, you fix one thing and two others pop up. So make sure that no other problems have appeared with your fix. And then we need to be patient, because some solutions actually take time to show, especially when it comes to things like user testing. So if you're in beta and you're actually trying to figure out how satisfying are weapons or cars or something like that, then you might have to wait for feedback from a large group of people, which can take a while. Pipeline problems as well, notorious for not showing immediate results. So for example, with meetings or deadlines and stuff like that, we just need to be patient and wait. And then we have to remember that at the end of the day, troubleshooting is an iterative process, and this is especially true for auditory problems. So I have had a couple of times now where in projects, when I'm working on the thing, I'm not happy with it, and then eventually the deadline has to be pushed, and that means that, sorry, I just got a Skype call, so I put my Skype on silent, but apparently it came through, and that just threw me. So troubleshooting, iterative process, especially for audio people, auditory problems, just make sure that you remember to just follow the process, and eventually it'll hopefully go into place. And don't be afraid to experiment and try new things, and also not to get it right the first time. Oftentimes we get it wrong, and well, shit happens, but eventually we'll hopefully get it right. So with the mission briefing done, let's dive in to solve some technical problems. First off, we've got a magic spell system. So each couple of spells, one of the spell sounds starts to repeat endlessly until the next spell is deactivated. So we need to reproduce this. What is happening? So one of the sounds loops, apparently, because it happens only with a specific sound. When is it happening? Well, it's only happening with a certain spell and a specific sound. Where is it happening? It's happening everywhere, but only with that specific spell. So that means that this problem is not location dependent, but rather within the system. Now we need to debug. we need to ask why. So we need to check the asset. Is it correct? Is it hooked up to an event? What are the settings? We need to check the profiler. Is everything being triggered? Is it being triggered too often? If so, by what? And we need to check the game engine. Is the hook set up correctly and being triggered as it should? Then we need to fix and test. So in this case, we need to identify where it went wrong and fix it. So if this is, in this specific example, turns out the sound setting of the asset was set to loop, and that was within a random container. So each time it selected that sound, it would just loop until then the next sound in the container would be played and the one before will be stopped. Now we need to test if it works 100%, and then we're good to go. So looking at some other technical problems. Let's say a footstep sound is being triggered too often, causing multiple instances of the sound to overlap. Well, that might be a game engine problem with too many audio events in the animation. In this case, we go into the game engine and we take out some of the animation events, then we test again. What about the ambience if it's not changing during the day-night cycle? Well, that might be a middleware issue on the asset where the RTPC wasn't hooked up correctly and so it wasn't changing. So we need to go into the settings, make sure the RTPC is correct, and then test it. Or the dialogue lines of an NPC can be heard on the entire map. Again, if you've been in this industry for a while, then you might think, maybe it's attenuation, and that is correct. The middleware, in the middleware, the attenuation wasn't set on the asset. So there you go. These are just a couple of examples with different solutions. So going on to auditory problems. Let's look at this. The level in a horror game doesn't feel scary enough. This immediately becomes a lot more lofty than a bug. So for reproduction, we need to figure out primarily where is this happening in this level. So is it throughout the whole level? And we've come to the conclusion and spoken to the team that it's at the start and the midpoint of the level. So then we can say, okay, why is this? Well, there's very little going on visually and the sound is not doing enough. So the audio needs to build more tension, especially in the ambience. So we need to introduce some more stuff. So now we can fix and test, and we have decided to put in more layers into the 2D ambience. We could also add in 3D emitters with some random paths, meaning that they basically could be some one-shots that then change in terms of the panning, creating kind of like a very eerie ambience. And then we could have some volume triggers in the level that play scary cine sounds when you walk past them, and they don't have to have any visual attached. So just with those couple of solutions, we can make the level feel way more scary. Okay, looking at some more problems. There's too much going on at once when there are lots of enemies on screen. Well, this is probably a mix issue. There's not enough sounds being called, and so what's sounds are the most important? That's what we need to ask ourselves, and then we need to kill some of the sounds that aren't as important to make space for everything else. The UI doesn't fit with the rest of the soundscape. Again, many different potential issues. In this case, it could be a design issue. The person didn't follow the audio direction who designed it. Maybe we need to then figure out how can we communicate it better? Can we use references? Can we give feedback earlier? How do we solve this? Now to pipeline problems. These are the nastiest of them all because they're multi-pronged and kind of tricky. So this one, a common one. Animation timings keep changing and the audio team isn't being made aware of the changes and only finding them in retrospect. So we need to reproduce them first. The animation and audio is desynced, leading to more work for the audio team. That is pretty clear. That's what's happening. So it's been happening throughout the entirety of development. That's when. And then it's also happening where exactly? With a large majority of the animations that are being revised. So it doesn't happen in the beginning, it's mainly with the revised ones. So then we need to figure out, well, why is this happening? Okay, there's no communication channel to update on the changes, and there's no fixes, no fixed animation lock dates, so it just gets revised and there's no actual time where we say, okay, we're locking it. So how do we fix this? Well, we can speak to a producer and we can create a communication pipeline. Then we can enforce an animation lock, saying that at this point, we're gonna cut off any more changes. You're not allowed to make more changes after this point. And then we need to agree on this and start to track it. Couple more pipeline problems. Regularly scheduled meeting with no clear purpose or objectives is wasting development time instead of saving it. I'm sure you've had many of these. It is a process issue. So if there's no producer present, we need to get in a producer. Maybe there's no agenda, maybe there's no clear purpose. So if there's no reason, we can scrap it. Otherwise, we want to bring in a producer, have an agenda, create a clear purpose. What about if the levels are taking hours to open and load? This has happened to us, and this might actually be more simple in this case, which could be a systemic issue where the external devs don't have access to the shader cache, meaning that they have to reload the shaders each time. So this could be a case where then we ask the tech director, how can we solve this? And then we can create a solution together. But what if we get into a serious pickle? Well, in that case, we can call for help with the SOS beacon, and that is when the rubber duck just doesn't do its job. And we need to ask humans for help. Who can you ask for help? Well, your coworkers are a great place to start, including your non-audio coworkers. Talk to programmers, talk to producers, talk to designers, talk to leads and directors. They will very, very generally, pretty much all the time, be super happy to help you because you're all on the same team. You're trying to work towards the same goal, and that is a bug-free great game. Friends, of course, and the community, Airwiggles, great place. However, don't breach NDAs. That's always important to say as a caveat. But you can always talk around problems. So let's wipe some bugs out together. Prevention is hard to quantify and not very sexy, unfortunately. And that's why you hear people flex with, I fixed this amount of bugs today, versus you don't hear people say, I prevented so many bugs today, because it's very hard to actually track how many bugs you have prevented and how many problems you prevented. So yeah, it's less of a cool metric and less of a, I guess, cerebrally productive metric to actually think about. But what are some prevention methods? Well, the general pathway is we want to get to the root of the problem first, which means figuring out the underlying problem rather than just fighting the symptoms, which we've already kind of done a lot here. Then we want to record the data as well. So we want to figure out what happened, as all the stuff that we've already done, what, when, where, and how did this happen. And then we want to record that, because then once we have it, once we've done it once, we know the solution. We don't have to do it again. And we can then also ask, how did we solve it? Also, we can put contingency plans into place. So these are basically plans that we ask ourselves, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? Or how can we make sure this doesn't happen in the first place? And we also ask, what are we going to do if something similar happens again? So first off, getting to the root, destroying the nest. So we can look at a pipeline problem as an example. A senior member of the team has left the company, leaving a large knowledge gap that needs to be filled. First off, we can ask why. Why did this happen? Why is there a knowledge gap? Because someone left. Why did this create a knowledge gap? Because their knowledge wasn't documented anymore. Why wasn't it documented? Because there's no process for doing so. And why is there no process or pipeline? Because no one had considered what would happen if someone left. So to get to this, we just asked why a bunch of times. And so we've discovered that the core problem is that the team members' knowledge is not being documented well enough because there was no process in place for it. So what are some potential solutions? Well, we can train staff to a higher level across the board so that no one person is solely responsible for a task. We can also create and maintain a company wiki with all the necessary information that workers can refer to. However, we will also have to allocate time in the workday for employees to actually document the processes on a regular basis. And then we can prevent this from happening in the future rather than just dealing with it when it happens. But we don't need to try and prevent every problem. 20% is actually enough. And as we've established, it's relatively easy to prevent problems that you've already encountered, but what about the ones you haven't? Well, the good thing is that 80% of problems stem from only 20% of the causes, according to the Pareto principle, which is also known as the 80-20 rule. Of course, it's not hard and fast, but it's about kind of the majority of your problems come from the minority of the causes. And these are called the vital few, and the goal is to just focus on those vital few key problems in each category to prevent them. So I want to share some common prevention methods for each of the 3 categories that I kind of have learned over the years through my own experience or through different people. So first, for the technical problems, we want to make sure that we build reliable and stable systems. This is especially important, not just for the sound designers inside of Wise, and also like in terms of how you have your projects and naming and all of that, but also for the technical sound designers and audio programmers who especially work in the engine. So you want to take responsibility to make it work properly. And that can be tricky, especially if you're running up against the deadline, you have to hack something together. But the more stuff that is hacked together is on top of each other, we just end up with like a Jenga tower of doom that will eventually just collapse in on itself and break everything. The second thing is that we want to test things before submitting, because you might have broken something, and I have had instances where I have sheepishly pushed something to the server and then realized, oh, whoopsie, I have broken something else. And that's never cool. Slack message, especially when you break the build. Then we want to use placeholder sounds. That makes testing more reliable. So this is a big one, especially if you're working together with programmers or technical sound designers. Put together a folder with some loop-based, or just like having a loop, a one-shot, and maybe some other sounds like ambience and music that you can then simply use to test stuff. Because sometimes on paper something might look like it's working correctly, but then when you realize and test it out, it doesn't. And that could have been avoided with placeholder sounds. Do not leave landmines. Submit finished work when possible. So when we submit unfinished work, someone gets in there, changes some stuff, and then you submit the second half, and yeah, it all gets tangled and mixed up and becomes a minefield, because now you have to untangle it like those old earbuds with the wires that we don't have anymore. So yeah, that can be a pain. And then lastly, buddy checking your work. It's always good to have a second pair of ears and eyes, or eyes and ears. And yeah, just having someone else check over it can be really, really helpful. On to auditory problems. So big thing is to not forget the core functions of audio, which means building a believable world, providing feedback to the player, conveying information to the player. Those are the 3 big pillars that we want to make sure to cover. And not every sound has to cover all of these pillars, but we just want to have these in mind when we're designing something, because it will have to cover one of the pillars. Then we want to follow the audio direction. It's really the North Star for us, so we should let it guide us. And if you don't have one, if you're working solo, then I think it's really useful to actually prevent them, to create one. And that will prevent a lot of problems down the line. Then using references is really helpful, especially when doing feedback. So as a point of comparison, like references can be great, because if someone says, oh, make it sound more sleek, and I don't know what, I have an idea of what sleek means, but the other person has also a different idea of what sleek means, they maybe can show us an example of that, and then we can figure out, aha, that's what they mean. Then we want to get feedback early and often. So early check-ins means early corrections, and that means staying on course. And those are the most common prevention methods for auditory problems. Now onto pipeline problems, the scary ones. So we want to create a clear and well thought out processes. This means things like how meetings are conducted, what software is and isn't being used, how are file names formatted, how do we communicate with each other. So the more these systems and processes are in place, the easier it will be for everyone, because we can actually just refer to all of these processes and don't have to have different ones each time a different member does something, and then kind of sync up later. Then we want to talk to the team a lot. We want to tell people what we are doing. We want to also ask people what they are doing. And we want to make sure that the decisions that we make which might have an impact for other people, are told to them before we make them. So yeah, talking to people, having your morning stand-ups, being present, listening out, saying stuff and potential blockers and problems is really, really important. Asking a lot of questions is also good. This kind of refers to the processes. This is how we build the processes. So are we going to rent equipment and record the vehicle sounds, or are we going to buy a library and plugins instead? Pipelines need to be generated for both. How is the budget and the time spent? What are the most important sounds for the game? How often are you going to check in with other teams? So all these questions, when we can answer them, it's going to make our life a lot easier, because then those question marks won't be there anymore. Then we can document what doesn't work, and we can put this into the postmortem. So we want to be staying on the lookout for problems, and we want to be thinking about how to prevent or solve them. And the ones that we do encounter, especially the big ones, we want to make sure to put them in the postmortem, the ones that cause big issues, because then the next time around we can make sure that that doesn't happen. So we did that, for example, with AirCon is last year. When we finished it, we did a big postmortem, and we kind of wrote down all the things that didn't go so well and how we want to make it better. Then last but not least, pipeline problems are everyone's problems. So don't wait till someone else fixes it. Attack! Right. How do we practice problem solving? Well, first off, I would say programming is an amazing place to start. And I'm not saying do a computer science degree, but just some very, very basic stuff, because it teaches us logic, and when you're writing instructions that a computer interprets literally, you can't skip any of the steps, otherwise it just won't work. So you will very much learn how to do things one by one. Then we've got game jams, which are excellent places for problem solving, because they have very tight time constraints, and whenever there's time constraints, you have to really prioritize, and that means lots of problems. Making your own game. I did this in university, just made a very, very small, simple game. That taught me so much. And then paper simulation, so just asking what could go wrong if we do this? How would we approach to fix it? So it's, again, these kind of different plans for how you're going to deal with situations. And all of these are low stakes environments, which are not during the job. So you can train in a safe place, and then when you get to working, then it will be a lot easier, because the stakes will be higher and you've already had your training in the low stakes training environment. Problems, in my opinion, are good, and they help level you up, because problems are a learning opportunity, and each one carries a lesson. And the more we learn, the more XP we gain, and the more XP we have, the more we level up. And that means we can acquire new skills and new tools that we can use. And you build your Frustrationstoleranz, which is an excellent German word, and it means tolerance for frustration, or kind of resilience in the face of setbacks. And that helps you just not get frustrated and stay calm. And yeah, this is basically something you just have to practice. Some people are better at it than others, but keeping calm makes solving problems so much easier, because you're not stressing, you're just looking at it zoomed out, and then you can follow the process. So yeah, as my old boss used to say, you learn more on a bad day than on a good one. And with that, I want to thank you all for coming.